The two horses chained in the snow had stopped eating 3 days ago, waiting to die, when James Carter placed a single apple in front of them. What happened next would save more than just their lives. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The winter wind cut through the Montana wilderness like a blade, carrying with it the kind of cold that settles deep into your bones and refuses to leave. James Carter stood at the edge of the frozen clearing, his breath forming small clouds in the bitter air, his left arm still wrapped in a sling from the injury that had changed everything. The doctors had told him the damage to his shoulder was permanent, a souvenir from his last deployment that would remind him every day of the explosion that had torn through his unit. But physical pain was something James had learned to live with. It was the other kind of pain, the kind that kept him awake at night, that had brought him to this remote stretch of wilderness in search of something he couldn't quite name. He had been driving for hours along the old logging road trying to clear his mind when he first heard it. A sound that didn't belong in the stillness of the winter forest. It was faint at first, almost lost beneath a whisper of wind through the pines, but unmistakable once he focused on it. The desperate, haunting cry of horses in distress. James had grown up around horses on his grandfather's ranch in Wyoming, and he knew that sound. It was the sound of animals pushed beyond their limits, calling out in a desperation that transcended species. He pulled his truck to the side of the narrow road and climbed out, ignoring the protest from his injured shoulder as he zipped his jacket tighter against the cold. The sound was coming from somewhere deeper in the woods, beyond the line of snow-covered pines that stood like silent sentinels guarding the wilderness. Every instinct told him to investigate, even though the rational part of his mind whispered warnings about venturing into unfamiliar territory in these conditions. But James had spent too many years following orders, too many nights haunted by the faces of people he couldn't save. If there was something out here that needed help, he wasn't going to turn away. The snow was deep, reaching almost to his knees in places, and each step forward was a battle against the frozen landscape. His boots crunched through the icy crust, and more than once he stumbled over hidden obstacles buried beneath the white blanket. The cold was relentless, seeping through his clothes despite the layers, making his injured shoulder ache with a fierce persistence. But he pressed on, following the sound that grew louder with each difficult step. The cries were coming more frequently now, filled with a raw desperation that made his chest tighten. When he finally pushed through a dense cluster of pine branches and emerged into a small clearing, what he saw made him stop dead in his tracks. 2 horses lay in the snow, their bodies pressed close together as if seeking warmth from each other in the brutal cold. One was black as midnight, its coat dull and matted, while the other was pale, almost white, its once beautiful color now dingy with dirt and neglect. But what made James's blood run cold wasn't their condition, though that was bad enough. It was the heavy chains wrapped around their legs, thick metal links that had been fastened so tightly they had rubbed the skin raw. The chains were attached to iron stakes driven deep into the frozen ground, giving the horses barely enough length to move a few feet in any direction. Around them, scattered in the snow, were remnants of hay that had clearly been there for days, maybe longer. The horses hadn't touched it. Their ribs showed prominently through their thin coats, and their eyes held that glazed, distant look that James had seen too many times before in creatures, both human and animal, who had given up hope. They had stopped eating, stopped fighting, simply waiting for the end to come in this frozen prison. James felt rage building in his chest, a white-hot anger that momentarily drove away the cold. What kind of person would do this? Who would chain these magnificent animals out here in the wilderness and leave them to starve and freeze? The questions burned through his mind as he took a cautious step forward. The black horse lifted its head slightly, watching him with wary eyes that held more resignation than fear. The pale horse didn't even acknowledge his presence, its head resting on the snow as if the effort to lift it was too much to bear. He had no phone signal out here, no way to call for help, and even if he did, he wasn't sure who he would call. This was wilderness, miles from the nearest town, and from the look of things, these horses had been here for a while. Someone had gone to considerable effort to bring them here and chain them, which meant this wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. The thought made his stomach turn. James knelt down in the snow, ignoring the cold seeping through his jeans, and studied the situation. The chains were thick and secure, the kind that would require bolt cutters or a heavy-duty saw to remove. The stakes were driven deep, and with only one good arm, getting them out would be nearly impossible. But as he looked into the eyes of the black horse, saw the flicker of something that might have been curiosity or might have been the last ember of will to survive, James made a decision. He didn't know how he was going to do it, didn't know if he even could, but he knew he couldn't walk away. These horses were trapped, forgotten, left to die alone in the cold. And if there was one thing James Carter understood, it was what it felt like to be trapped by circumstances beyond your control, haunted by memories, unable to see a way forward. Maybe that's why he felt such a powerful connection to these abandoned creatures. Maybe that's why, despite the pain, despite the cold, despite every rational reason to turn back, he knew he was exactly where he needed to be. He stood slowly, his mind already racing through possibilities, calculating what he would need, what he could do with his limited mobility. The sun was getting lower in the sky, and the temperature would drop even further once darkness fell. These horses had somehow survived another night, but James could see they didn't have many more left in them. Whatever he was going to do, he needed to do it fast. But first he needed to try something, needed to see if there was any spark left in these animals, any reason to believe they wanted to be saved. James walked back to his truck, his mind focused on a single thought. He had come out here looking for purpose, looking for something to fill the emptiness that had consumed him since coming home. Maybe he had found it. Maybe salvation wasn't something you found for yourself. Maybe it was something you gave to others. James rummaged through the back of his truck with his good arm, pushing aside emergency supplies and camping gear until he found what he was looking for. A thick wool blanket, a canteen of water, and most importantly, the bag of apples he had bought at a roadside stand earlier that day. They were crisp and fresh, meant to be a snack for his long drive, but now they represented something far more important. They represented hope, a bridge between despair and survival. He grabbed everything he could carry and made his way back through the snow, following his own tracks from before, each step feeling more purposeful than the last. When he returned to the clearing, neither horse had moved. They lay there in the snow like statues carved from exhaustion and abandonment, their breathing shallow and labored. James approached slowly, speaking in a low, calm voice that he hoped would convey his intentions. He had learned in the military that tone mattered more than words when communicating across barriers of language or species. It was the intention behind the sound that reached beyond understanding, that touched something primal and universal. He stopped a few feet from the black horse, the one that had at least shown some awareness of his presence earlier, and knelt down in the snow. The cold bit through his jeans immediately, but he ignored it. From his pocket, he pulled out one of the apples and held it forward on his open palm, letting the horse see it clearly. The black horse's ears twitched slightly, the first real sign of response James had seen. Its nostrils flared as it caught the scent of fresh fruit, something its body desperately needed but its broken spirit had refused to accept. "Come on," James whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. "I know you're tired. I know you've given up. But you don't have to die out here, not today, not like this." The horse's dark eyes focused on the apple, then on James's face, as if trying to determine whether this was another cruel trick or a genuine offer of help. James remained perfectly still, his arm extended, ignoring the ache that was building in his shoulder from holding the position. He had learned patience in the most difficult circumstances imaginable. He could wait as long as it took. Minutes passed. The pale horse still hadn't moved, its breathing so shallow that James had to watch carefully to confirm it was still alive. But the black horse was watching, considering, fighting some internal battle between the instinct to survive and the despair that had convinced it survival was impossible. James saw the moment something shifted in those dark eyes, saw the tiny spark of will flicker back to life. The horse stretched its neck forward, moving with painful slowness, and its lips touched the apple. Then, with deliberate care, it took the fruit from James's hand. The sound of the horse chewing was like music to James's ears. It was the sound of choice, of a creature deciding to fight for one more day. He pulled out another apple and offered it, and this time the black horse took it more quickly, its body remembering what food meant, what nourishment could do. After the second apple, James moved carefully to the pale horse, his heart heavy as he got closer, and saw just how dire its condition was. This one was worse off than its companion, its body more emaciated, its spirit more deeply broken. He placed an apple directly in front of the pale horse's nose, close enough that it wouldn't have to move to reach it. The horse's eyes were closed, and for a terrible moment, James thought he might be too late. But then the nostrils flared slightly, catching the scent, and slowly, so slowly it was almost imperceptible, the pale horse opened its eyes. They were clouded with pain and exhaustion, but there was something else there too, a question. James recognized that look. It was the same look he had seen in the mirror every morning since coming home. The look that asked whether there was any point in going on, whether the effort was worth the pain. "You're stronger than you think," James said softly, placing his hand gently on the horse's neck. The skin was cold to the touch, too cold, and he could feel the bones beneath. "I know what it's like to feel like giving up. I know what it's like when the darkness seems easier than fighting. But I'm here now, and I'm not leaving you. Neither of you. I promise you that." The pale horse looked at him with those questioning eyes, and then, in a movement that made James's throat tighten with emotion, it stretched its head forward and took the apple. As both horses ate, James examined the chains more closely. They were industrial strength, the kind used for heavy machinery or securing cargo, completely overkill for restraining animals. Whoever had done this had wanted to make absolutely certain these horses couldn't escape. The metal had rubbed away fur and skin where the horses had struggled, leaving raw wounds that made James's jaw clench with anger. But anger wouldn't help them now. Action would. He spread the wool blanket over both horses, tucking it around them as best he could to provide some protection from the wind. They didn't resist, which told him how desperate their situation truly was. Wild horses, even ones in distress, typically didn't accept human contact so readily. But these two were beyond fear, beyond the instinct to flee. They had crossed into that territory where survival meant accepting help from any source, even one they had been taught to fear. James stood and looked around the clearing, studying the terrain, the trees, the way the land lay. He was forming a plan, but it would require supplies he didn't have, and help he wasn't sure he could find. The nearest town was at least 30 miles back the way he had come, and his truck didn't have the capability to transport 2 full-grown horses, especially not in their weakened condition. But he couldn't leave them here overnight without better protection, without more food and water, without medical attention for their wounds. The sun was sinking lower, casting long shadows across the snow. James made a decision. He would drive back to town, get the supplies he needed, and return before dark. It would be tight, but it was possible. He knelt down again, between the 2 horses, looking first at the black one, then at the pale one. "Listen to me," he said firmly. "I have to leave for a little while, but I'm coming back. Do you understand? I'm coming back. You just have to hold on a little longer." The black horse watched him with those intelligent eyes, and James could have sworn he saw understanding there, saw willingness to trust this stranger who had appeared in their darkest hour. The drive back to town was the longest 30 miles of James's life. Every bump in the road, every minute that ticked by on the dashboard clock, felt like a betrayal of the promise he had made to those horses. His mind raced with worst-case scenarios, images of returning to find them gone, their fragile hold on life finally giving way. He pushed the accelerator harder than he should have on the icy road, his good hand gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The injured shoulder throbbed with each jarring movement of the truck, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the urgency burning in his chest. Pine Ridge was the kind of small Montana town that time seemed to have forgotten, a single main street lined with weathered buildings that had stood for generations. The late afternoon sun cast everything in shades of gold and amber, making the snow-covered roofs sparkle like they had been dusted with diamonds. Under different circumstances, James might have appreciated the quiet beauty of the place. But right now, all he could think about was getting what he needed and getting back to those horses before darkness fell completely and the temperature dropped even further. He pulled up in front of the hardware store, a squat building with faded red paint and a hand-painted sign that read Miller's Hardware and Feed. A bell chimed as he pushed through the door, and the warmth of the interior hit him like a wall. An older man behind the counter looked up from a newspaper, his weathered face creasing into a welcoming smile that spoke of decades spent greeting customers in this exact spot. "Help you find something, son?" the man asked, folding his newspaper and setting it aside. James walked quickly to the counter, his mind organizing the list of supplies he needed. "I need heavy-duty bolt cutters, the strongest you have. Also need horse feed hay if you've got it. Medical supplies for treating wounds on animals, blankets, water containers, and anything else you'd recommend for horses that have been neglected and exposed to extreme cold." The smile faded from the man's face, replaced by concern and something that looked like recognition. His eyes traveled to James's sling, then back to his face, reading something there that made him nod slowly. "You find those horses out on the Blackwood property?" he asked quietly. James felt his heart skip. "You know about them?" The older man sighed heavily and came around from behind the counter. "Name's Carl Miller. I own this place. And yeah, I know about those horses. We all do." He gestured for James to follow him toward the back of the store. The Blackwood Ranch belonged to a man named Vincent Blackwood. Real piece of work, that one. Thought he could make money breeding and selling wild Mustangs, but he had no idea what he was doing. Lost everything about 6 months ago, bank took the property, and he just up and disappeared. Left everything behind, including those 2 horses. James felt the anger rising again, hot and fierce. You knew they were out there and nobody did anything. Carl turned to face him, and James saw genuine pain in the older man's eyes. "We tried, son. Believe me, we tried. Sheriff went out there, but the property's in legal limbo. Bank says they're not responsible for the animals, and Blackwood's nowhere to be found. Animal control said they didn't have the resources to rescue them, especially not in winter conditions. We've been arguing about it for weeks, making phone calls, trying to figure out who has jurisdiction. Meanwhile, those poor creatures have been out there suffering." The explanation didn't make James any less angry, but he could hear the frustration in Carl's voice, the helplessness of people who wanted to help, but were trapped by bureaucracy and legal complications. "How bad are they?" Carl asked, beginning to gather supplies from the shelves. "Bad," James replied. "They've stopped eating. They're chained up, barely moving. If someone doesn't help them soon, they're not going to make it." Carl moved with purpose now, pulling items from shelves and stacking them on the counter. Heavy-duty bolt cutters, first aid supplies, feed specifically formulated for malnourished horses, electrolyte supplements, wound dressing, thick blankets designed for large animals. As he worked, other people in the store began to notice, began to gather around. A woman with kind eyes and gray hair stepped forward. "Those horses are still alive?" she asked, her voice trembling. James nodded. "Barely, but yes." The woman turned to someone behind her. "Martha, call Dr. Henderson. Tell him we need him." Within minutes, the quiet store had transformed into a hub of activity. Word spread with the speed that only small towns can manage, and people began arriving, bringing supplies, offering help. A younger man introduced himself as Tom and insisted on lending his trailer to transport the horses once they were freed. An elderly couple brought blankets they had been collecting for weeks, hoping someone would finally be able to reach the animals. A woman named Sarah, who identified herself as having veterinary training, put together a comprehensive medical kit. James stood in the middle of this whirlwind of generosity, overwhelmed by the response. These people had been waiting for someone to take action, waiting for someone who could cut through the red tape and just do what needed to be done. Carl rang up the supplies and then waved away James's money when he tried to pay. "You're doing what we should have done," he said firmly. "Least we can do is help with the cost." James wanted to argue, but the determined look in Carl's eyes told him it would be pointless. By the time James loaded everything into his truck, the sun was touching the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Tom pulled up beside him with a horse trailer hitched to his truck. "I'm coming with you," he announced, not asking, but stating a fact. "You're going to need help getting those chains off and loading them. And Doc Henderson's on his way. He said he'd meet us out there." James wanted to say he could handle it alone, that he had made a promise and needed to keep it himself, but the practical part of his mind knew he was being offered exactly what he needed. So he simply nodded and climbed into his truck. The convoy of vehicles headed out of Pine Ridge as darkness began to fall, headlights cutting through the growing gloom. James led the way, his heart pounding with a mixture of anxiety and hope. He had left those horses alone for hours, had asked them to hold on, to trust him. Now he was returning with an army of support, with everything they needed to survive. He just prayed he wasn't too late, that the spark of life he had seen in their eyes hadn't flickered out while he was gone. The road stretched ahead, familiar now, and James pressed forward into the night, racing against time and cold and the fragility of life itself. The headlights illuminated the narrow path through the woods as James pulled his truck to a stop at the same spot where he had parked hours earlier. Behind him, Tom's truck with the horse trailer came to a halt, followed by Doc Henderson's vehicle. The three men climbed out into air that had grown significantly colder with the setting sun. James could see his breath forming thick clouds, and the temperature gauge on his dashboard had read 15 degrees. In these conditions, every minute mattered. James grabbed a powerful flashlight from his truck and led the way through the snow, following his earlier tracks that were now partially filled in by wind-blown powder. His heart hammered against his ribs as they pushed through the pine branches into the clearing. He swept the flashlight beam across the snow, searching, and there they were. Both horses were still in the same positions, the wool blanket he had left still draped across them, though it had shifted slightly. The black horse lifted its head at the sound of their approach, and James felt a wave of relief so intense it made him dizzy. "They're alive," he called back to Tom and Doc Henderson. "Thank God, they're still alive." The three men moved quickly into the clearing, their boots crunching through the snow. Doc Henderson, a man in his 60s with silver hair and steady hands that spoke of decades of experience, immediately knelt beside the pale horse, his medical bag already open. He worked quickly, checking vital signs with practiced efficiency while Tom positioned portable lights around the clearing, transforming the dark wilderness into a makeshift rescue operation. James went straight to the black horse, kneeling in the same spot where he had knelt hours before. The horse's eyes found his, and in that moment, James felt something pass between them, a recognition that went beyond words. "I told you I'd come back," he said softly, placing his hand on the horse's neck. "I always keep my promises." He pulled more apples from his pocket and offered them, and the black horse ate with more enthusiasm than before, its body remembering what it meant to have fuel, to have hope. "These animals are severely hypothermic and malnourished," Doc Henderson announced, his voice grave as he examined the pale horse. "Their body temperatures are dangerously low, and they're both dehydrated. We need to get them warm, get fluids in them, and treat these wounds before we can even think about moving them." He looked up at James with respect in his eyes. "You got here just in time. Another night out here and we'd be too late." Tom had brought propane heaters from town, and he set them up around the perimeter of where the horses lay, creating a pocket of warmth in the frozen wilderness. The effect wasn't immediate, but James could see both horses respond to the change in temperature, their bodies instinctively moving closer to the heat sources. Meanwhile, Doc Henderson prepared electrolyte solutions, warm fluids that he would need to administer slowly to avoid shocking their systems. "Now let's deal with these chains," Tom said, pulling out the heavy-duty bolt cutters. The anger was evident in his voice as he examined the thick metal links. "What kind of monster does something like this?" James positioned the flashlight so Tom could see clearly, and together they approached the black horse. "Easy now," James murmured to the animal. "We're going to get these off you, but it might be loud." The horse watched him with those intelligent dark eyes, and when Tom positioned the bolt cutters and began to work, the horse remained still, as if understanding that this pain was necessary for freedom. The sound of metal cutting through metal echoed through the clearing, sharp and final. One chain fell away, then another. With each severed link, James felt like he was cutting away more than just physical restraints. He was cutting away neglect, abandonment, cruelty. When the last chain fell from the black horse, the animal made a sound, a low whicker that might have been relief or might have been gratitude. James ran his hands over the raw wounds the chains had left, his jaw clenched with fury at the person who had done this. They moved to the pale horse, and this process was more delicate. The horse was weaker, less responsive, and Doc Henderson watched carefully as Tom worked with the bolt cutters. The moment the chains fell away, the pale horse's breathing seemed to change, becoming slightly deeper, as if some burden had been lifted beyond just the physical weight of the metal. James gently arranged fresh blankets around both horses, layering them for maximum warmth, while Doc Henderson worked on treating the wounds with antiseptic and bandages. "We need to get food into them slowly," Doc Henderson explained as he worked. "Their digestive systems have essentially shut down. Too much too fast, and we could do more harm than good." He had brought special feed mixed with supplements designed specifically for starving animals, and he showed James how to offer it in small amounts. The black horse ate readily, but the pale horse was more reluctant, requiring gentle encouragement and patience. Hours passed in that clearing as the three men worked. The heaters hummed, creating an island of warmth in the frozen wilderness. James sat between the two horses, feeding them small portions, talking to them in that same calm voice, telling them about his ranch, about the warm barn they would have, about the life that waited for them beyond this nightmare. Tom refilled water containers and adjusted blankets while Dr. Henderson monitored vital signs and administered medications. Around midnight, something remarkable happened. The black horse, gathering strength from the food and warmth, made an effort to stand. Its legs trembled violently, and at first James thought it would collapse, but Tom moved quickly to support one side while James supported the other. The horse swayed, its muscles weak from days of lying in the snow, but it remained upright. "That's it," James encouraged. "You can do this. You're stronger than you think." The horse took one tentative step, then another, and though it was clearly exhausted, there was determination in its movements. The pale horse watched its companion's effort, and something shifted in its clouded eyes. Doc Henderson noticed it too. "That's what we needed," he said quietly. "That's the will to survive coming back. He's seeing his friend stand, and he wants to do the same." They spent another hour working with the pale horse, supporting it, encouraging it, until finally, with tremendous effort, it too rose to its feet. Both horses stood on shaking legs in the glow of the portable lights, steam rising from their bodies in the cold air, alive and fighting when hours ago they had been ready to surrender to death. The journey back to James's ranch was slow and careful, with Tom driving the horse trailer at a crawl to avoid jostling the fragile animals inside. James followed close behind in his truck, unable to take his eyes off the trailer, as if by watching he could somehow ensure their safe passage. Doc Henderson rode with Tom, ready to respond if either horse showed signs of distress during the transport. The roads were icy and treacherous in the early morning hours, but Tom navigated them with the skill of someone who had driven these mountain passes his entire life. James's ranch sat on 40 acres of rolling Montana landscape, a property he had purchased with his military savings when he returned from overseas. He had dreamed of creating a sanctuary, a place where he could find peace after years of chaos and violence. But since coming home, the ranch had remained largely empty, the barn unused, the pastures quiet. He had been unable to find the purpose, the drive to fill it with life. Now, as he pulled through the gate with the horse trailer following behind, James realized that maybe this was what the ranch had been waiting for all along. The barn was old but sturdy, built by the previous owner decades ago, and maintained well enough to withstand Montana winters. James had spent some of his sleepless nights over the past months repairing stalls and checking the structure, work that had seemed pointless at the time, but now felt like preparation for this exact moment. He jumped out of his truck and hurried to open the barn doors, flipping on lights that illuminated a clean, spacious interior with 4 large stalls bedded with fresh straw. Tom backed the trailer up to the barn entrance with practiced precision, and the 3 men worked together to lower the ramp. The black horse emerged first, moving slowly but with determination, its eyes taking in the new surroundings with cautious interest. James guided it to the nearest stall where water and food waited. The horse entered without resistance, and once inside it immediately began to drink. Long, deep gulps that spoke of desperate thirst finally being satisfied. The pale horse required more assistance. It had expended tremendous energy just standing and loading into the trailer, and now its legs trembled with exhaustion. James and Tom supported it on either side, moving in sync, speaking in low, encouraging tones as they guided it to the stall next to its companion. Once inside, the pale horse lowered itself carefully to the straw and lay down with a deep sigh. Doc Henderson was immediately at its side, checking vitals, adjusting blankets, ensuring it was positioned comfortably. "We're going to need to monitor them closely over the next several days," Doc Henderson said as he stood and brushed straw from his knees. "Their bodies have been through tremendous trauma. They'll need frequent small meals, constant access to water, and warmth. These wounds need to be cleaned and dressed twice daily until they start healing properly." He looked at James seriously. "This is going to be a full-time commitment for a while. Are you prepared for that?" James looked at the 2 horses, the black one standing in its stall munching hay while the pale one rested with its eyes half closed. He thought about the emptiness that had consumed his days since returning home, the hours spent trying to find meaning in a life that no longer made sense. He thought about the moment he had found these animals, abandoned and dying, and the sense of purpose that had flooded through him. "Yes," he said firmly, "I'm prepared. This is what I need to be doing." Tom clapped him on the shoulder with a grin. "You've got help too. Half the town's been feeling guilty about those horses for months. Folks will want to pitch in, bring supplies, check on them. You won't be alone in this." The words brought unexpected comfort to James. For so long he had isolated himself, convinced that no one could understand what he was going through, that he had to face everything alone. But tonight had shown him something different. Community meant something in a place like Pine Ridge. People cared. Doc Henderson spent another hour showing James how to properly dress the wounds, how to prepare the special feed mixture, what signs to watch for that might indicate complications. He left detailed instructions written in neat handwriting and a schedule for when he would return to check on the horses. "Call me immediately if anything changes," he insisted. "Day or night, doesn't matter. These two have been through hell. We're not losing them now." After Tom and Doc Henderson left, promising to return the next day, James found himself alone in the barn with the two horses. The early morning light was just beginning to filter through the windows, casting everything in shades of soft gray. He pulled up an old wooden chair and sat between the two stalls, his body exhausted, but his mind too active for sleep. The black horse came to the front of its stall and hung its head over the door, watching him with those intelligent eyes. "I'm going to call you Midnight," James said quietly, "because you're black as midnight and because this is the start of a new day for you." The horse's ears flicked forward at the sound of his voice. "And your friend," he continued, looking at the pale horse resting in the straw, "I'll call him Ghost, because he was so close to becoming one, and because he's pale as moonlight." The names felt right, felt like they captured something essential about these animals and the journey they had all begun together. Ghost opened his eyes at the sound of his new name, and for the first time, James saw something in that gaze that wasn't pain or exhaustion. It was interest, a faint curiosity about this new place and this man who had refused to let them die. James stood and walked to Ghost's stall, entering slowly and kneeling in the straw beside the horse. He placed his hand on the animal's neck, feeling the warmth that was slowly returning to its body, the steady heartbeat that hours ago had been so weak. "You know what I think?" James said softly. "I think we're all here for a reason. I think I was meant to find you two today, and you were meant to give me something to fight for." He paused, his throat tight with emotion. "I came home from war broken, just like you two were left broken. Nobody knew what to do with me either. But maybe we can help each other heal. Maybe that's how this works." Midnight nickered softly from the adjacent stall, as if agreeing with his words. James smiled, the first genuine smile that had crossed his face in months. He remained there in the straw with Ghost, his back against the stall wall, while Midnight dozed, standing up nearby. The barn was warm and peaceful, filled with the sounds of horses breathing and the occasional rustle of straw. For the first time since coming home, James felt something settle in his chest, something that might have been peace, or might have been purpose, or might have been both. The first week with Midnight and Ghost was the hardest James had experienced since his final days in the hospital after his injury. The horses required round-the-clock care, and James threw himself into the task with an intensity that surprised even him. Every 3 hours, day and night, he was in the barn offering small portions of the specialized feed, checking water levels, monitoring their vital signs, and changing the dressings on their wounds. Sleep became something he grabbed in brief snatches between feedings, collapsing on the old couch he had moved into the barn's tack room. Doc Henderson came by twice daily for the first 3 days, his experienced eyes assessing every detail of the horse's condition. On the 4th morning, as he finished examining Ghost, he straightened up and nodded with satisfaction. "They're going to make it," he announced, "both of them. Their vitals are stabilizing, the wounds are starting to heal properly, and they're keeping food down. You've done good work here, James." The words meant more to James than the doctor could know. They were validation that his efforts mattered, that his dedication was making a difference. True to Tom's prediction, the people of Pine Ridge began showing up at the ranch. At first it was just a few, bringing extra hay or bags of feed, staying to help with chores or simply to see the horses that everyone had worried about for so long. But word spread quickly, and soon James found himself receiving visits from people he had never met, all of them wanting to contribute in some way. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who ran the diner in town, brought home-cooked meals that she insisted James eat. "You can't take care of them if you don't take care of yourself," she scolded gently. And her food was so good that James found himself actually eating full meals for the first time in months. A teenager named Danny started coming by after school every day, fascinated by the horses and eager to learn. He would sit on the stall door and watch as James worked, asking endless questions about horse care, about Midnight and Ghost's condition, about everything. At first, James found the constant chatter exhausting, but gradually he realized that Danny's enthusiasm was infectious, his genuine care for the animals touching something in James that had been locked away. The kid reminded him of the young soldiers he had mentored overseas, full of energy and idealism and hope. By the end of the second week, both Midnight and Ghost were showing remarkable improvement. The black horse had regained significant weight, his coat beginning to show the luster that proper nutrition brings. He moved around his stall with growing confidence, and when James entered the barn each morning, Midnight would whinny in greeting, clearly recognizing the man who had saved him. The bond between them deepened with each passing day, built on trust and routine, and the understanding that comes from shared experience. Ghost's recovery was slower, but no less impressive. The pale horse still spent much of his time lying down, but he was eating consistently now, and the cloudiness had left his eyes. There was a gentleness to Ghost that touched everyone who met him, a quiet dignity that seemed to transcend his suffering. Where Midnight was energetic and vocal, Ghost was contemplative and serene. James found himself drawn to both horses for different reasons, seeing in each of them different aspects of his own journey toward healing. The wounds from the chains were healing well under Doc Henderson's treatment protocol, though they would leave scars that would always mark what these animals had endured. James cleaned and dressed the wounds with meticulous care, his touch gentle, despite his own damaged shoulder that often ached during the repetitive motions. The physical pain was a small price to pay for the satisfaction of seeing healthy tissue, replacing the angry inflammation that had been there when he first found them. One morning in the third week, James arrived at the barn to find both horses standing at their stall doors waiting for him. Ghost had been standing more and more each day, building strength in his legs, but this was the first time James had arrived to find him already up. The sight made his throat tight with emotion. He approached Ghost's stall slowly, and the pale horse stretched his neck forward, touching his nose to James's hand in a gesture that was unmistakably affectionate. James stood there, his forehead resting against Ghost's neck, feeling the warmth of the animal's body and the steady rhythm of his breathing. "You've come so far," he whispered. "Both of you. You're fighters." The black horse nickered from the adjacent stall, clearly wanting attention too, and James laughed, moving to give Midnight the same greeting. The morning routine had become sacred to him, these quiet moments in the barn before the day truly began, when it was just him and the horses and the soft sounds of the ranch waking up around them. As the horses grew stronger, James began taking them outside for short periods, letting them feel the sun on their backs and breathe fresh air. The first time Midnight stepped out of the barn into the paddock, he stood perfectly still for a long moment, as if he couldn't believe he was free to move without the weight of chains. Then he took a tentative step forward, then another, and suddenly he was moving, not running but walking with purpose, exploring every corner of the enclosure. Ghost followed more slowly, staying close to James at first, but gradually venturing farther as his confidence grew. Danny was there that day, helping to supervise the horses' first time outside, and the boy's face lit up with pure joy as he watched them explore. "This is amazing," he breathed. "They're really going to be okay, aren't they?" James nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. They were going to be okay. All three of them were going to be okay. The town's investment in the horses' recovery went beyond just supplies and visits. Carl from the hardware store organized a fundraiser to help cover the mounting veterinary bills and feed costs. The response was overwhelming, with donations coming from people James had never met, people who had simply heard the story and wanted to help. The generosity humbled him, made him realize how much he had underestimated the power of community, the willingness of people to rally around a cause that touched their hearts. But the greatest gift wasn't the money or the supplies. It was the way caring for Midnight and Ghost had pulled James out of the darkness that had consumed him. The nightmares still came sometimes, the memories of war still haunted him, but now he had a reason to get up in the morning, a purpose that extended beyond his own pain. In saving these horses, he was discovering that maybe he was saving himself too. 1 month after the rescue, James stood at the fence of the larger pasture, watching Midnight and Ghost move freely across the snow-dusted ground. The transformation in both animals was nothing short of miraculous. Midnight had filled out considerably, his black coat now gleaming with health, muscles rippling beneath his skin as he trotted confidently around the perimeter. Ghost moved more deliberately, still building strength, but there was a grace to his movements now that had been completely absent in those first desperate days. The pale horse had become James's shadow, following him everywhere, seeking his presence with a devotion that went beyond simple gratitude. The scars from the chains remained visible on both horses' legs, permanent reminders of their ordeal. But James had come to see those scars differently now. They weren't marks of shame or weakness. They were badges of survival, proof that these animals had endured the unendurable and come out the other side stronger. He understood that perspective intimately. His own scars, both visible and invisible, no longer felt like failures. They were evidence that he had survived, that he was still fighting. Danny had become a regular fixture at the ranch, arriving every afternoon after school to help with whatever needed doing. The teenager had proven himself remarkably capable and dedicated, taking on more responsibilities as James taught him about horse care. Today, Danny was mucking out stalls while James prepared the evening feed, and they worked in comfortable silence, broken only by the sound of Danny's shovel and the horses moving in their pasture. "Mr. Carter?" Danny's voice came from inside Midnight's stall. James looked up from measuring grain. The teenager rarely called him by his formal name anymore. "Yes?" James responded. Danny emerged from the stall, leaning on his shovel with a thoughtful expression. "I was wondering something. What are you going to do with them? I mean, now that they're getting healthy. Are you going to keep them?" The question caught James off guard, though he realized he had been avoiding thinking about it. The truth was, he hadn't planned any of this. He had found 2 dying horses and acted on instinct, on a need to save something that could still be saved. But what came next? Midnight and Ghost couldn't stay in the barn forever. They were wild Mustangs at heart, meant for open spaces and freedom. Yet the thought of them leaving, of this barn being empty again, made something twist painfully in his chest. "I don't know," James admitted, setting down the feed scoop. "I haven't thought that far ahead." Danny nodded slowly. "My dad says you've given them something more important than just saving their lives. He says you've given them trust again, that after what happened to them they should be terrified of people, but they trust you completely." James felt the weight of that observation. It was true. Both horses had bonded with him in a way that seemed to transcend normal animal-human relationships. It was as if they understood that he had fought for them when no one else would, and that understanding had created an unbreakable connection. That evening, after Danny had gone home and the chores were finished, James sat on the fence rail watching the horses graze in the fading light. The temperature had dropped with the setting sun, and his breath formed clouds in the cold air. Tomorrow would mark exactly 6 weeks since he had found them chained in that frozen clearing. 6 weeks that had changed everything. His ranch was no longer empty. His days were no longer meaningless. And most surprisingly, he was no longer alone. The sound of a vehicle coming up the drive pulled James from his thoughts. He recognized Doc Henderson's truck and climbed down from the fence to greet him. The veterinarian had reduced his visits to once a week now that the horses were stable, but he always seemed to show up when James needed to talk to someone. They had developed a friendship built on mutual respect and shared purpose. "How are our miracles doing?" Doc Henderson asked as he approached, his medical bag in hand. "See for yourself," James replied, gesturing toward the pasture. Both horses had noticed the doctor's arrival and were walking toward the fence, Midnight leading with Ghost close behind. Doc Henderson watched them approach, and a smile spread across his weathered face. Remarkable, absolutely remarkable. He climbed the fence to get a better look, his trained eyes assessing their condition from a distance. Their movement is good, weight is where it should be. "James, you've done something extraordinary here." They spent the next hour going over the horses' progress, with Dr. Henderson giving them both thorough examinations. When he finished, he stood with James by the barn, his expression serious but warm. "You know, I've been a veterinarian for 37 years. I've seen a lot of animals in bad situations. Most of them don't make it, not because they can't physically survive, but because they give up. They lose the will to fight. These two had given up when you found them. The fact that they're standing here today, healthy and strong, that's not just good veterinary care. That's what happens when someone refuses to give up on them." James felt his throat tighten. "I think they saved me as much as I saved them," he admitted quietly. Doc Henderson placed a hand on his shoulder. "That's usually how it works. Healing is a two-way street." He paused, then continued. "I heard through the grapevine that you're thinking about what comes next for them." James nodded. "I can't keep them in that pasture forever. They need more space, more freedom. But I'm not sure what the right answer is." "Have you considered starting a sanctuary?" Doc Henderson asked. The question surprised James. "A sanctuary?" The doctor nodded. "For rescued horses. God knows there are enough of them out there that need help. You've got the land, you've got the skills now, and you've got the support of the entire town. These two could be the beginning of something bigger." James looked out at Midnight and Ghost, watching them interact with each other in the peaceful evening. A sanctuary, a place where broken things could heal, where animals who had been abandoned could find safety and purpose. The idea took root in his mind immediately, feeling right in a way that nothing had felt right in years. He thought about all the empty pastures on his property, all the unused barn space. He thought about Danny's enthusiasm and the town's generosity. He thought about how caring for these two horses had given him direction when he had been drifting. Maybe that was exactly what he was supposed to do. Maybe this was his mission now, his way of taking all the pain and trauma and transforming it into something good. "I think that might be exactly what I need to do," James said slowly. Doc Henderson smiled. "Then count me in as your official veterinarian. No charge for rescue cases, and I suspect you'll have plenty of other volunteers once word gets out." The transformation of James's ranch into a sanctuary happened faster than he could have imagined. Word spread through Pine Ridge and beyond about what he was attempting to build, and the response was overwhelming. Tom showed up with his construction crew, offering to expand the barn and build additional shelters at cost. Carl organized another fundraiser, this time specifically for the sanctuary project, and the community responded with characteristic generosity. Mrs. Patterson from the diner started a volunteer schedule, coordinating people who wanted to help with daily care, construction, or simply spending time with the horses. James found himself at the center of something much larger than he had anticipated. The sanctuary needed a name, and after much consideration, he settled on Second Chance Ranch. It felt appropriate given that both he and the horses had been given unexpected opportunities to start over. He registered it as a non-profit organization with help from a lawyer in town who donated her services, and suddenly what had begun as a spontaneous rescue mission was becoming a legitimate operation. Danny had appointed himself assistant manager, a title James granted with amusement but also genuine appreciation. The teenager had proven invaluable, his enthusiasm never waning even during the hardest work. Together they repaired fences, cleared pastures, and prepared for the possibility of more rescues. The physical labor was good for James. It gave him a constructive outlet for his energy and helped rebuild strength in his injured shoulder through gradual, purposeful use. Some days, the pain was significant, but he pushed through it, finding that the discomfort mattered less when he was working toward something meaningful. 3 months after finding Midnight and Ghost, James received his first official rescue request. A woman 2 counties over had contacted him about a horse that had been seized from an abusive situation and needed placement. The animal, a chestnut mare named Rusty, arrived on a cold March morning. She was thin and skittish, flinching at sudden movements and showing clear signs of past trauma. James recognized the look in her eyes immediately. It was the same look Midnight and Ghost had worn, that mixture of fear and resignation that came from suffering at human hands. He placed Rusty in a stall with clear sight lines to Midnight and Ghost's paddock, knowing that seeing other horses thriving would be important for her recovery. The approach worked better than he had hoped. Within days, Rusty was watching Midnight and Ghost with obvious interest, and when James finally moved her into a paddock adjacent to theirs, the 3 horses spent hours at the fence line, communicating in ways that only they understood. Midnight seemed to take on a protective role, standing close to the fence nearest Rusty while Ghost would approach slowly and extend his neck in gentle greeting. The dynamic between the horses fascinated James. It was as if Midnight and Ghost understood what Rusty had been through because they had experienced similar trauma. They were patient with her in ways that James found deeply moving, never pushing, always present, but never threatening. He watched as, over the course of weeks, Rusty gradually relaxed, her body language shifting from constant vigilance to occasional moments of peace. The transformation reminded him that healing wasn't a linear process. It happened in fits and starts, in tiny victories and occasional setbacks, but it happened nonetheless if you had the right support. By summer, Second Chance Ranch was home to 7 horses, each with their own story of survival. There was Thunder, a gray gelding rescued from a hoarding situation where dozens of horses had been found starving. There was Bella, an old mare whose owner had died and whose family had simply turned her loose rather than arranging for her care. There was Scout, a young Mustang who had been hit by a car and needed months of rehabilitation. Each arrival brought new challenges and new opportunities for growth, both for the horses and for James. The sanctuary became known throughout the region, and James found himself receiving calls from animal control officers, veterinarians, and concerned citizens about horses that needed help. He couldn't save them all, but he saved the ones he could, and he helped place others with reputable rescue organizations when Second Chance Ranch was at capacity. The work was exhausting and often heartbreaking, but it gave James a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life for years. Danny graduated from high school that spring and announced his intention to stay on at the ranch full-time, at least for a year before considering college. James tried to talk him out of it, insisting that the teenager should pursue his education, but Danny was adamant. "This is what I want to do," he said firmly. "You've shown me what it means to make a difference. I can go to college anytime. Right now, these horses need us, and I need to be here." James understood that determination. It was the same force that had driven him to spend that first night in the barn, refusing to leave until he was certain Midnight and Ghost would survive. The sanctuary attracted volunteers from unexpected places. A group of veterans from the VA hospital in Helena started coming regularly, finding in the work with traumatized horses a therapeutic outlet for their own struggles. James watched as these men and women, many dealing with PTSD and physical injuries similar to his own, found connection and purpose in caring for animals who understood suffering. The horses seemed to sense the veterans' pain, responding to them with particular gentleness. It was as if they recognized kindred spirits. One of these veterans, a woman named Sarah who had served as a combat medic, became particularly attached to Ghost. The pale horse, who remained more reserved than Midnight with most people, would walk directly to Sarah whenever she arrived and rest his head against her shoulder. Sarah would stand with him for long stretches, not speaking, just existing together in shared silence. James learned that she had been struggling with severe depression since her discharge, that she had been barely functioning before someone told her about the sanctuary. Now she came 3 times a week, and the change in her was visible. The light was returning to her eyes just as it had returned to Ghost's. These connections, these unexpected moments of grace and healing, made everything worthwhile. The hard days, the financial struggles, the physical exhaustion, all of it faded into insignificance when James watched a broken horse take its first confident steps or saw a struggling veteran smile genuinely for the first time in months. He had created something that transcended his original intention. Second Chance Ranch wasn't just about saving horses. It was about creating a space where healing could happen, where broken creatures of all species could find their way back to wholeness. The first anniversary of finding Midnight and Ghost arrived on a crisp winter morning that reminded James achingly of that day when everything had changed. He walked out to the pasture where both horses grazed peacefully, the early sunlight casting long shadows across the snow-dusted ground. They looked up at his approach, Midnight whinnying and greeting, while Ghost walked over to press his pale face against James's chest. The gesture of affection, so freely given now, still moved James deeply. He wrapped his arms around Ghost's neck, feeling the solid warmth of the animal, the steady heartbeat that once had been so fragile. "A year ago you were dying," James said softly. "We all were, in our own ways." He thought about the man he had been then, hollow and lost, driving aimlessly through the wilderness searching for something he couldn't name. That version of himself seemed like a stranger now. The nightmares still came occasionally, and some days his shoulder hurt so badly he could barely lift his arm, but the darkness that had consumed him had lifted. Purpose did that. Love did that. Being needed did that. The sanctuary had grown beyond his wildest expectations. They now cared for 15 horses, with a waiting list of animals needing placement. The expanded barn that Tom and his crew had built stood solid and warm, equipped with everything necessary to handle medical emergencies and long-term rehabilitation. The volunteer roster included over 40 people from Pine Ridge and surrounding towns, each contributing according to their abilities. Some brought feed or supplies, others provided labor, and still others simply came to spend time with the horses, finding their own healing in the quiet presence of these rescued animals. James had established a special program specifically for veterans, offering them a structured opportunity to work with the horses as part of their recovery process. The VA hospital in Helena had officially partnered with Second Chance Ranch, referring patients who might benefit from equine therapy. The results were remarkable. Men and women who had been trapped in cycles of depression and anxiety found relief in the simple act of caring for creatures who understood trauma without judgment. The horses asked nothing of them except presence and kindness, and in return offered unconditional acceptance. Sarah, the combat medic who had bonded so deeply with Ghost, had become one of the program's greatest success stories. She now coordinated the veteran volunteer program, using her medical background and personal experience to help others navigate their healing journeys. James had watched her transformation with quiet amazement. The woman who had arrived, barely able to make eye contact, now stood before groups of veterans, sharing her story with raw honesty and offering hope through her own recovery. Ghost remained her constant companion during these sessions, the pale horse seeming to understand his role in her healing. Danny had proven himself indispensable to the sanctuary's operation. The young man had grown in confidence and capability, taking on increasing responsibility with maturity that belied his years. He had enrolled in online veterinary technician courses, studying at night after long days of physical labor. James had become something of a father figure to him, and Danny in turn had become the son James had never had. Their relationship, built on shared purpose and mutual respect, was yet another unexpected gift that had emerged from that day in the frozen clearing. On this anniversary morning, James had planned something special. The entire town had been invited to Second Chance Ranch for a celebration, a recognition of what the community had built together. As the day progressed, people began arriving, filling the ranch with warmth and laughter. Mrs. Patterson brought enough food to feed an army, setting up tables laden with dishes that steamed in the cold air. Tom arrived with his family, his children racing immediately to the paddocks to see their favorite horses. Carl brought a handmade wooden sign that read, "Second Chance Ranch, where healing happens," in elegant carved letters. Doc Henderson arrived with news that made the celebration even more meaningful. The State Veterinary Association had recognized Second Chance Ranch with an award for outstanding animal welfare work. More importantly, they had secured a grant that would fund the sanctuary's operations for the next 2 years, removing the constant financial pressure that had been James's primary source of stress. The announcement was met with cheers and applause, but James felt overwhelmed by emotion. He stepped away from the crowd, needing a moment to process everything. He found himself back at the fence line, watching Midnight and Ghost. The two horses had remained inseparable, their bond forged in shared suffering now expressed in companionship and trust. They grazed side by side, occasionally touching noses in communication only they understood. James marveled at their resilience, at the capacity of living creatures to heal from even the most severe trauma when given safety and support. They had taught him that survival was possible, that recovery was real, that second chances were worth fighting for. A small hand tugged at his jacket, and James looked down to find a little girl, maybe 6 years old, looking up at him with wide eyes. "Are you the man who saved all the horses?" she asked with the directness of childhood. James knelt down to her level, his heart full. "I helped them," he said gently. "But really they saved me." The girl considered this seriously. "My daddy says that's how it works sometimes. The helping goes both ways." Her simple wisdom, delivered with such innocence, captured the entire truth of what Second Chance Ranch had become. As the celebration continued around him, James stood surrounded by the community that had embraced his vision, watching horses that had been sentenced to death now thriving in safety, seeing veterans finding purpose and healing, and feeling a peace he had thought lost forever. He had set out that morning a year ago with no plan, no expectation, just a need to answer the cry of suffering creatures. What had emerged from that single act of compassion had transformed not just the horses' lives, but his own and those of countless others. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Midnight and Ghost moved to the fence where James stood, flanking him on either side like guardian sentinels. He reached out to touch them both, feeling the solid reality of their presence, the undeniable proof that hope was real and healing was possible. In that moment, surrounded by love and purpose, James understood that he had found what he had been searching for all along, not in isolation or in trying to outrun his pain, but in opening his heart to the suffering of others and allowing their healing to become intertwined with his own. 5 years passed like water flowing through James's fingers, each day bringing new challenges and unexpected joys. Second Chance Ranch had become a landmark in Montana, known throughout the region as a place where miracles happened regularly. The sanctuary now spanned over 100 acres, with multiple pastures, 3 barns, and facilities designed specifically for equine rehabilitation. At any given time, they cared for between 20 and 30 horses, each one carrying a story of survival and resilience. James stood at the fence of the main pasture on an early autumn morning, watching the herd move together across the golden grass. Midnight and Ghost were still there, now elder statesmen of the sanctuary, their presence providing stability and comfort to newly arrived horses. Both had aged gracefully, their bodies strong despite the years and the trauma they had endured. The scars on their legs remained visible, faded now but still present, silent testimony to what they had overcome. The sanctuary had expanded its mission beyond just housing rescued horses. James had developed a comprehensive program that paired traumatized horses with veterans struggling with PTSD, creating a therapeutic environment where healing happened through mutual understanding. The program had gained national attention, with researchers from universities coming to study the outcomes. The data showed what James had known intuitively from the beginning. Broken things recognize each other, and in that recognition they find the strength to heal. Danny, now 23, had become the sanctuary's operations manager. He had completed his veterinary technician certification and was considering applying to veterinary school. But more than his technical skills, what made Danny invaluable was his gift for connecting with both the horses and the people who came to work with them. He had inherited James's understanding that healing wasn't just about physical recovery, but about restoring dignity and purpose to lives that had been shattered. The veteran program had grown significantly, with over 200 veterans having gone through the structured therapy sessions. Sarah, who had first arrived at the sanctuary 5 years ago, barely able to function, now ran the program with compassion and expertise. She had returned to school, earned a degree in social work, and dedicated her life to helping other veterans find the same healing she had discovered. Ghost remained her constant companion, the pale horse now trained as a certified therapy animal, his gentle presence bringing comfort to countless struggling souls. James had watched transformation after transformation, each one reinforcing his belief that second chances were not just possible but essential. He had seen men and women arrive at the ranch hollow-eyed and hopeless, carrying wounds that no one else could see, and watched as working with the horses gradually brought them back to life. The horses asked nothing of them except presence and care, offering in return acceptance without judgment. In the simple act of brushing a horse's coat, cleaning a stall, or sitting quietly in a pasture, these veterans found moments of peace that had eluded them for years. The financial sustainability that had once seemed impossible was now a reality. Grants, donations, and partnerships with veteran organizations provided steady funding. The community of Pine Ridge had never wavered in its support, continuing to volunteer time and resources. Mrs. Patterson, now in her 80s, still brought food for special occasions. Tom's construction company maintained all the buildings without charge. Doc Henderson, though semi-retired, remained the sanctuary's primary veterinarian, refusing to accept payment for his services. But the greatest measure of success wasn't found in numbers or accolades. It was found in moments like this one, as James watched a newly arrived veteran named Marcus take his first tentative steps into Midnight's pasture. Marcus had served 3 tours overseas and returned home, unable to reconnect with civilian life. He had been referred to Second Chance Ranch by the VA as a last resort before more intensive psychiatric intervention. James had seen that look in Marcus's eyes before, the combination of desperation and skepticism, the expression that said he had given up believing anything could help. Midnight, as if sensing exactly what was needed, walked slowly toward Marcus. The black horse, now showing gray around his muzzle, moved with the wisdom of an elder who had seen suffering and survived it. He approached Marcus and simply stood there, his presence calm and non-judgmental. Marcus reached out with a shaking hand and touched Midnight's neck. And in that moment, something shifted. James saw it happen, that tiny crack in the armor of pain that Marcus had built around himself. It was the same crack that had appeared in James's own defenses 5 years ago when he first connected with these horses. "You don't have to talk about it," James said quietly, walking over to stand beside Marcus. "You don't have to explain or justify or make sense of anything. You just have to be here and let yourself feel whatever comes." Marcus nodded, unable to speak, tears streaming down his face as he leaned against Midnight. The horse stood perfectly still, bearing the weight of Marcus's pain with the same patience he had shown countless others. This was what Midnight and Ghost had become: healers, teachers, living proof that survival was possible and recovery was real. As the morning sun climbed higher, James reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He thought about that frozen day when he had heard the cries of dying horses and made the decision to help. He had no way of knowing then that saving those 2 animals would save him as well, that their recovery would chart the course for his own healing. He had been lost, broken, unable to find meaning in a world that no longer made sense. But in choosing to fight for creatures who could not fight for themselves, he had discovered his purpose. The ranch was filled now with the sounds of life: horses whinnying, volunteers laughing, the rhythmic sound of hammers as new construction continued to expand their capacity. Every sound represented hope, represented the possibility of transformation, represented the simple truth that love and commitment could overcome even the darkest circumstances. James had learned that healing wasn't a destination, but a journey, one that required patience, compassion, and the willingness to keep showing up even on the hardest days. Midnight lifted his head and looked directly at James, those wise, dark eyes holding recognition and something that looked remarkably like gratitude. James walked over and wrapped his arms around the horse's neck, pressing his face against the warm coat, feeling the steady heartbeat that had once been so fragile. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for giving me a reason to keep going. Thank you for teaching me that broken things can heal. Thank you for the gift of purpose." The horse stood quietly, accepting the embrace, and in that moment, everything that had happened over the past 5 years made perfect sense. They had saved each other, and in doing so had created something that would continue saving others for years to come.